Hey, everybody. It is Thursday, January 2nd, 2025. New year, same podcast, same co-host. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wununu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we still read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, happy New Year.
And a happy 2025, Moshe, to you and to everybody who's listening.
Jill, I understand you made it up past midnight.
First time in 8
years. I would have lost that bet if I put money on it.
Me too, by the way. I wasn't planning to. And the next thing I knew, I'm like, oh my God, it's 2025. It's January.
So I feel like the new Dick Clark is the Andy Cohen, Anderson Cooper New Year's Eve, right? I mean, I'm sure some people probably watch the Seacrest thing, but that to me seems like they've established themselves.
I love Andy Cohen. So to me, that's what to watch.
We were toggling between that, and then we ended up catching, we had never watched the Martha Stewart documentary on Netflix, which was actually phenomenal. And for anyone who remembers that whole era, her going to jail, etc., looking back at it now, you realize that she was basically put in jail for not actually committing a crime by a upstart U.S. attorney named James Comey. It's fascinating, actually, the backstory there. But her whole life backstory was very interesting to kind of get a sense of. But that whole era, I mean, it's as we've gone back and sort of recalibrated the Monica Lewinsky story and the Menendez brothers story and the OJ story, all the various 90s, early 2000s stories that we sort of have a better perspective on 20 years later. Martha Stewart, I would highly recommend this documentary to get a better sense of what actually took place 20 years ago.
I loved it also. I thought it was so fascinating. And it was interesting because Martha Stewart said she didn't like it. And I think that she comes off looking really good.
Oh, I think she looks great. I mean, I think she's her own, as you see in the documentary and in life, her own harshest critic. But I thought I've renewed respect for Martha Stewart after watching that.
Okay, to the headlines. A New Year's Eve celebration turned deadly in New Orleans. What we know about the person who drove a truck into a crowd in the French Quarter and then opened fire on the crowd.
Yeah, we have the latest on the federal investigation into the terror attack there.
He said, she said. Justin Baldoni files a $250 million lawsuit against the New York Times over its Blake Lively story.
And it comes as she's now filed her own lawsuit in addition to her own complaint. This keeps getting messier.
To politics, President-elect Trump weighs in on the race for Speaker of the House, why he's throwing his support behind Mike Johnson.
And will that be enough for Mike Johnson? We'll be watching that vote very closely starting tomorrow at noon.
And while we were off for the holiday, Jimmy Carter passed away at the age of 100, the funeral plans, and a look at his legacy. Plus, the new laws taking effect in 2025, from guns to gym memberships to minimum wage increases. The latest on the investigation into the worst air tragedy in years, the plane crash in South Korea over the weekend. A big travel trend we're watching: more women want a vacation alone. And welcome to the world, Generation Beta, which officially began with people who were born on January 1st.
Yes, and all the previous generations now move farther back in line.
Remember when millennials were the rage, Moshe?
We were the rage, yes, and then you had Gen Z were the fresh ones, and then Alpha generation, and now even the Alphas. Well, you guys have a newer generation to answer to at some point.
And Moshe has on this day in history.
Jill, a big day in music history to kick off the year.
All right, we're going to begin with the terrorist attack in New Orleans. A driver rammed a pickup truck into a crowd in New Orleans' French Quarter early on New Year's Day, killing 15 people before being shot to death by police. More than 35 others were injured in Wednesday's attack, which turned festive Bourbon Street into mayhem. The FBI identified the driver as 42-year-old Samsidine Jabbar. He is a U.S. citizen, reportedly born and raised in Texas, and a U.S. military veteran who was honorably discharged several years ago. Investigators are working to gather additional information about Jabbar's background. They're also looking into an unfurled black ISIS flag that he was flying behind the truck. They also announced Wednesday afternoon that they don't think that Jabbar acted alone, that there could be co-conspirators, but they're still not revealing much as of Wednesday evening. Jabbar appears to have rented a Ford F-150 truck through Turo, which is kind of like Airbnb, but for cars. The actual owners of that truck, they say they were shocked that their vehicle was used for the attack. In the early morning hours, about 3:15 a.m. Eastern time, Jabbar drove around barriers with the intent to kill as many people as possible on Bourbon Street. Authorities said he was, quote, hell-bent on creating carnage. He then got out of his vehicle with a gun, and he was killed in a firefight with police. Investigators recovered a handgun and an AR-style rifle after the shootout and were combing the French Quarter for potential explosive devices. Officials also found 2 improvised explosive devices near the scene.
Yeah, one of the reasons why they think he might not have acted alone here, he's got the IEDs. It seems to have been a well-planned attack here. Jill, it came as, in addition to everyone who was reveling, headed to Bourbon Street for New Year's Eve, New Orleans is set to host the Sugar Bowl, college football playoff game between Georgia and Notre Dame. That game was actually set to take place last night, but due to the attack, they decided to postpone the game 24 hours out of an abundance of caution. So the Sugar Bowl game right now is set to take place tonight in New Orleans. Authorities say, despite the fact they don't believe he acted alone, they believe that the situation is secure and they can move on with the game here. You also have Mardi Gras coming up in the next few weeks in New Orleans. You also have the Super Bowl happening in New Orleans. Jill, a lot happening down there. So they're taking this very seriously. Like many other cities around the world, there are security barriers, steel security barriers installed to prevent something like this, as car ramming attacks have become more popular as an MO in recent years by terrorists. A set of security barriers that were installed back in 2017 on Bourbon Street to prevent an attack just like this one were actually inactive and being replaced as of last night. They also apparently had an issue with some barriers, wedge barriers, not functioning. And so that's something they're looking into here. There is a replacement project scheduled right now. It is ongoing and was set to be completed ahead of the Super Bowl here. You can actually see in the surveillance footage, there was a police car parked to block traffic into the street, but you see the pickup truck that Jabbar was driving. You see him make a turn around onto the sidewalk and around the vehicle, basically sneaking through. And that's when he hits the gas there and starts to drive through folks on Bourbon Street. As far as these car ramming attacks, they've really ramped up since the 90s. The majority of them have taken place in the Middle East, where it's become an MO for Palestinian attackers against the Israelis. But we've also happened to see it a lot in the West in recent years. In Nice, France, there was an infamous attack with a truck in 2016. Charlottesville, Virginia, New York City, there was one down on the West Side back in 2017. And there have been a couple attacks at German Christmas markets in recent years, hence why more and more cities around the world are installing those steel barriers to prevent these types of attacks in the future. Jill, they're still looking into the background here of Jabbar, what led him to do this, the fact that he was born and raised in Texas, a military veteran. There was that major attack on a military base in Texas years ago by Nidal Hassan, other U.S. veterans of note, Timothy McVeigh, Oklahoma City bomber. So we have seen this sort of thing in the past. And Jill, we're learning more and more as the evening goes on here on Wednesday night. It turns out Jabbar, who again was honorably discharged from the Army, had converted to Islam recently. That's according to Dwayne Marsh. He is married to Jabbar's ex-wife. Apparently, Jabbar and his ex-wife have 2 daughters, 15 and 20 years old. He notes that the girls are a mess, given what they're learning about what their father did here. Now, the husband of the ex-wife, of Jabbar's ex-wife, says that they learned of his recent conversion, and apparently he had been acting erratically of late, quote, being all crazy, cutting his hair after converting, according to that interview the New York Times did with Dwayne Marsh. Apparently it got to the point, they were so concerned about Jabbar's behavior, they stopped allowing his daughters, to be able to see him recently. So again, as the hours go by here, we're learning more and more about what went on here. It comes as there's a YouTube video out there that shows Jabbar back in 2020. He posted himself talking about his real estate business, pitching his real estate business to people, saying that he will insure as a broker, he will get you the best price, talking about his commitment, talking about his time in the U.S. military service with Affinity. So something went down here. in the past couple of years, in the past couple of months. Jill, another major investigation that's being looked at as a possible act of terror here in Vegas on the first day of 2025, a Cybertruck explosion outside the Trump Vegas hotel being investigated as an act of terror by federal authorities. This took place again in Las Vegas, separate from New Orleans. Not clear there's any connection between the two incidents, but authorities are investigating a Tesla Cybertruck that basically drove up to the front entrance of the Vegas hotel that Trump operates and then blew up. There's surveillance footage circulating. We posted a clip over on the Mo News Instagram account. The driver pulls up into the valet area with a Tesla Cybertruck. The vehicle explodes. The driver was killed. 7 other bystanders experienced minor injuries nearby. Now, investigators don't know what caused the blast specifically, but CNN reports late on Wednesday that inside the Cybertruck, there's evidence that fireworks, gas tanks, and camping fuel were inside the truck, and authorities believe that it was connected to a detonation system controlled by the driver. We don't have details on who the driver was, what their goals were, what their motivation was, but a concerning incident at the Trump Vegas Hotel on Wednesday, again, New Year's, separate from the incident that happened in New Orleans, where notably a Tesla Cybertruck, Tesla run by one Elon Musk, is loaded up with what appears to be fireworks and gas, explodes outside the hotel early on Wednesday morning. Not clear, again, what the intentions were of the driver, whether they intended to explode at the time they did. The only death was the driver themselves, and then some minor injuries experienced by the bystanders. One thing the federal government is looking at is a potential connection here between what happened in New Orleans and what happened in Vegas. A couple items. In both cases, the driver died. In both cases, they used the Turo app to rent the car out of state and then drive it to the location where the attack was. In both cases, they rented electric trucks. In the Vegas case, a Cybertruck. In the New Orleans case, an electric F-150. So a couple threads there. It's not clear as of late Wednesday night who the attacker was and if there was any connection between that attacker and the New Orleans attacker, or if they were seeking to send the same message. Clearly, different tactics here and potentially different intentions. But ultimately, President Biden gave a speech last night where he says the federal government is looking into potential connections between the two different attacks. So we're going to continue to monitor all the developments over on our Instagram account 24/7, as well as on this podcast over the coming days. But again, a couple of very concerning incidents to begin the year, attacks in New Orleans and in Vegas, and authorities still trying to get to the bottom of them.
Okay, now to one of the biggest stories in entertainment that we're watching. Multiple back and forth lawsuits in the legal dispute between actors Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, the co-stars of last year's Netflix hit film, It Ends With Us. So Baldoni is now part of this new $250 million lawsuit. It was filed Tuesday afternoon against the New York Times in Los Angeles Superior Court. Baldoni is among a group of 10 plaintiffs that also includes publicists who are now suing the newspaper for libel and what's called false light invasion of privacy. And that's over the December 21st Times article that's called "We Can Bury Anyone Inside a Hollywood Smear Machine." That New York Times story painted his movie co-star Blake Lively as an actress who allegedly endured months of sexual harassment from Baldoni and supposedly faced retaliation in the form of a calculated PR smear campaign because she voiced her concerns. Lively, in the lawsuit that she filed in New York federal court, accuses Baldoni and his PR team of marshaling a sophisticated, multi-tiered plan to undermine her reputation in retaliation for speaking up about sexual misconduct on the set of the film. She said Baldoni and others created a hostile work environment. The New York Times story painted a sympathetic portrait of her accusations. Meanwhile, in their lawsuit, Baldoni and several of the movie producers claim that the Times relied on cherry-picked information and altered communications that were stripped of necessary context and deliberately spliced to mislead. The complaint flips the Times reporting on its head, accusing Lively of orchestrating her own strategic and manipulative smear campaign and using false sexual harassment claims to assert unilateral control over the production of It Ends With Us, in which Lively and Baldoni both starred in and Baldoni directed. And the suit also accuses Lively's husband, actor Ryan Reynolds of aggressively berating Baldoni and pressuring his agents at WME to drop him as a client, which they did. A New York Times spokesperson said the paper plans to vigorously fight the lawsuit. They say their story was meticulously and responsibly reported and based on thousands of pages of original documents. The Times piece was written by several reporters, including Megan Twohey, who is one of the reporters who exposed Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah, so a complicated legal mess here. The New York Times reporting was based on a complaint that Lively filed with the California Civil Rights Department. That was the one we first told you about on the podcast before the holiday. So she has that complaint. And then she has a lawsuit against Baldoni. And now Baldoni has his own lawsuit, along with the publicists and producers here, against the New York Times. As for the New York Times story, it did detail instances in which Baldoni, according to the story, showed her explicit images and videos, asked her about her sex life, tried to add more intimate scenes into the movie's script, which she had not originally agreed to. But the issue here that Baldoni lays out in his lawsuit, that the Times picks and chooses various messages here. One example that Baldoni cites in his suit, back in June of 2023, Lively begins a text exchange with him in which she blames her assistant for not getting her a new batch of script pages. She then signs the message to Baldoni with X at the end, sort of the universal symbol for kiss there. She then follows up with another text saying, "I'm just pumping in my trailer if you want to work out our lines," implying she's just pumping milk and he should come over at any point. He then responds to that, and they don't include this in the New York Times story. Copy, eating with crew, will head that way. 18 months later, in the New York Times story, it was depicted in a more sinister light. The Times writing that Baldoni repeatedly entered her makeup trailer uninvited while she was undressed, including while she was breastfeeding. And so here, the impression that the Baldoni folks would like to put off here is that the Times was picking and choosing, was splicing things together to sort of put forth this sympathetic portrait of Lively. They have a lot of examples here. There's another one with publicists where they basically portray them as celebrating the various negative stories about Lively, but they don't include that the text messages actually, and this is revealed in their own suit, included the publicist saying, actually, we had no part of that, and sort of being sarcastic and doing emojis in that interaction. So a lot here between the complaint, the counter lawsuits here. Jill, it'll be fascinating to watch this proceed. It was actually one of the subjects that came up in our 2025 preview podcast that we put out on December 30th as one of the stories we were wondering about who will come across by the end of 2025 more positively and more negatively.
Right. As we were looking at winners and losers of the year, someone in the Mo News community had said that Baldoni was a loser. And I think we had said, just wait. Also, Blake Lively isn't looking great either.
We'll see what comes of it. Some people asked over on the Premium Instagram, that's where we've been doing coverage throughout the holidays, how are we going to finally know the truth about this all? I'm like, well, good luck to you. Ultimately, this sort of is the prime example of he said, she said. We'll see what all the text messages end up saying here. And that's what's notable in the counter lawsuit by Baldoni here, is that side appears to be ready to just say, look at all the messages here. So I think we'll get a sense to judge for ourselves what actually went down on that film set. Jill, I should say, we finally got around to watching that actually. Alex and I, over the holiday period as well, we hadn't caught it in the summer or fall, the film. And the film itself is very provocative, very heavy, has, a variety of sexual moments, handles very difficult subjects. So you can imagine that, the set itself was not always a light place. Now, as far as the allegations here, looking forward to continuing to learn more here as now these lawsuits get adjudicated.
All right, time for the speed read. Let's start with politics. From Politico, President-elect Trump said he is willing to make calls to lawmakers to drum up support for Mike Johnson should there be a risk to his speakership ahead of a vote expected Friday on Capitol Hill. Speaking briefly with reporters outside of a New Year's Eve party at Mar-a-Lago, the president-elect reaffirmed his support for the Louisiana Republican after his formal endorsement on Monday, saying, quote, He's the one that can win right now. The boost of support comes as Johnson's path to retaining the speakership is tenuous. With the expected makeup of Congress on Friday, he can only have 2 Republican defections, and Representative Thomas Massie from Kentucky has already indicated that he's going to oppose Johnson. The boost of support comes as Johnson's path to retaining the speakership is tenuous. With the expected makeup of Congress on Friday, he can only have 1 or possibly 2 Republican defections, and Representative Thomas Massie, a Republican from Kentucky, has already indicated that he's going to oppose Johnson.
Yeah, Massie, if you're not familiar with him, likes to zag where everyone else zigs. Literally, there are votes in Congress where he's the only person who opposes various things. And despite being a Republican, he thinks that they should replace Johnson here, which makes things very, very difficult for Johnson, even with the Trump endorsement, because the way the speaker vote works, and you might have watched this 2 years ago with the McCarthy vote, or I should say the 15 votes for Kevin McCarthy before he was able to finally get across the threshold. All the Democrats are likely to unite behind Hakeem Jeffries. They'll all vote for Hakeem Jeffries for speaker, even though they're in the minority, which means Republicans have to be effectively unanimous here, given how slim their majority is. Now, ABC News is reporting that beyond Massie, there's actually 15 House Republicans that, as of yesterday, said they're undecided, despite Trump's endorsement, which means Johnson is working the phones right now, trying to get them all on board. It means that every single Republican, no matter how junior and how little power they have power to exert here on Mike Johnson, get him to make certain promises to them. That's part of the deal here. And so ultimately, it's going to be fascinating to watch, Jill, partially because the vote starts on Friday. And if it's anything like the McCarthy vote, that lasted several days. Jill, January 6th, constitutionally, they need to certify the presidential vote. It'll happen on Monday, sort of like January 6th, 4 years ago. And so they need to certify here. But if they don't have a speaker, they can't get on with business. They can't certify Trump without a speaker, at least based on the current rules. So Republicans will have to get their act in order on Friday and figure out a way to get Mike Johnson through, or I should say Mike Johnson has to figure out a way to get himself through. And one of the issues he faces here with the slim majority, and we saw it with their ability to, at the last second to prevent a government shutdown in December, is he's going to need the help of Democrats. At least he need them for that. And that obviously upset some Republicans, saying, I can't believe you're working with the Democrats here to get certain things across. Democrats don't look like they're going to help him become speaker on Friday. So it could be a dramatic day/weekend up there on Capitol Hill that we'll be watching.
From the Washington Post, funeral plans have been announced for memorials for former President Jimmy Carter in Georgia and Washington, D.C. over the next week. The 39th president died on December 29th at the age of 100. Memorial services for Carter will begin this Saturday in Georgia, where the current and former Secret Service agents who protected Carter will carry his remains to a hearse. The motorcade will travel through Carter's hometown, stopping at his childhood home before continuing to the state capitol in Atlanta for a moment of silence. Then Carter will lie in repose at the Carter Center in Atlanta until Tuesday morning. His body will then travel to Washington. At the U.S. Navy Memorial, his remains will be transferred from the hearse to a horse-drawn caisson for the trip to the U.S. Capitol. There will then be a service at the Capitol Rotunda Tuesday afternoon, which is when Carter will lie in state at the Capitol until next Thursday morning, January 9th. The public is invited to pay their respects. And Moshe, if history is a guide, there are usually very long lines outside of the U.S. Capitol for these types of memorials.
Yeah, just a reminder here that presidents actually begin planning their own funerals while they're president. And Jimmy Carter left office in 1981, so they've been practicing and refining this game plan for his funeral for more than 40 years here. So January 9th is the official day of mourning here in the U.S. as of President Biden's announcement over the weekend. That means that actually the stock market will be closed on January 9th as well as part of that. And so that'll be Thursday morning. So the public has, again, a chance to see him in Atlanta and then in Washington. Thursday late morning, there will be a funeral at the National Cathedral at 10 a.m. That's where the Clintons, the Trumps, the Bushes, the Obamas are all set to attend, among other dignitaries. We haven't had a presidential funeral since 2018. That's when Bush 41 died. Notably, Jill, remarkably, this is the first Democratic president to die since LBJ in the 1970s. But it's going to be one of those rare moments in the National Cathedral where you see all the presidents there in a row together. It will be quite a month in Washington because then just about 11 days later, you have the inauguration. Where a number of the former presidents are set to attend as well. Notably, as far as Carter's funeral in Washington, President Biden is set to give a eulogy. The two presidents actually have a relationship dating back to 1976 when Joe Biden, then a very young senator, became the first Washington official to endorse Jimmy Carter for president. So their relationship goes way back. Biden made a point of visiting Jimmy Carter and his late wife, Rosalind, when he became president in 2021. And so Biden will give a eulogy as part of the ceremony here. Carter's remains will then return to Georgia. There'll be a private funeral, followed by a private internment at Carter's home. We should note that Biden has ordered U.S. flags to be flown at half staff for 30 days at all federal buildings, which means notably at the inauguration, that falls on the 30-day period. So flags will still be in half staff, despite the fact that we'll be inaugurating a new president, President Trump, on January 20th.
From The Hill and USA Today, states across the country are bracing for new laws set to take effect. Many actually already took effect as of yesterday, January 1st. And we wanted to do a roundup of some of these new laws. So Moshe, where you and I are both currently, Florida, the Sunshine State, effective yesterday, no one in this state under the age of 14 will be allowed to have a social media account. Social media platforms will be required to terminate any accounts suspected of belonging to someone under 14. Generally, the social media policy is a 13-year-old cutoff, but that is hardly enforced. Account owners will have 90 days to dispute it. A similar law is also on the books in Tennessee. In Louisiana, a new law will require the 10 Commandments to be displayed in public schools, including universities and colleges. But the legislation is in limbo after several civil rights groups sued to stop that law from being implemented. Before schools let out for winter break, the ACLU of Louisiana sent a letter to all superintendents for school boards not in the lawsuit, warning them of the federal judge's ruling and that if any other district displays the 10 Commandments, it also would be sued. In response, Louisiana's Attorney General Liz Murrill sent out her own statement saying she will support any school district that hangs up the 10 Commandments in 2025. So again, things still up in the air for more than 60 public school districts in the state. In other new laws in California, a law imposing harsher sentences for large-scale smash and grab retail theft goes into effect. It comes as there has been a surge in thefts in the state after they effectively decriminalized it in recent years.
Yeah, there's been a lot of backtracking on some of the criminal justice reforms that were passed over the last decade as they've seen retail theft and other crimes skyrocket in California and other states. Meanwhile, a couple other new laws, and again, there's hundreds of these out here, but we picked a few. In New Hampshire, gender-affirming surgery for minors beginning today is now outlawed. Physicians can be disciplined if they make any referrals regarding a gender-affirming procedure. New Hampshire saying that they're following the laws now that they've seen in Sweden, Norway, France, and the UK, where all those countries have taken a pause on gender reassignment surgery for kids. And it comes as there's a major Supreme Court case we've told you about regarding that, regarding the giving of hormones and other items for children. And we expect the Supreme Court to rule on this in late June, early July at the end of their current term. A couple other laws that have gone into effect here that we found of note in various states. In Texas, non-commercial cars will no longer be required to pass a safety inspection each year. That's a new legislation that goes into effect starting this month. Some law enforcement groups and other organizations say the new law could make driving more precarious in Texas. Sticking with driving here, Washington State is allowing harsher penalties for negligent driving in cases that include a fatality. Folks in Illinois, apparently you have a new law that'll make it easier for you to cancel your gym memberships. We all know how hard it is to do that, and Illinois has tried to come out on the side of the consumer here. Meanwhile, all eggs in Colorado, according to new law, must now come from a cage-free facility. So that's the rule now in Colorado. And Jill, we have a number of states that as of yesterday have upped the minimum wage. The federal minimum wage has not been increased for nearly 2 decades now. So states have taken it into their own hands. And so ultimately, 21 states are increasing their minimum wage. In California, your minimum wage goes from $16 to $16.50. It's one of 14 states that is now adjusting the minimum wage to increase for inflation. Beyond states, in some cases, I see 48 cities and counties have raised their own minimum wages above their state wage floors. So you see cities and counties here taking their own path when the states don't do enough as far as they're concerned.
Overseas, from CBS News, South Korean officials have vowed to find out what caused a Jeju Air commercial jet to crash into flames as it tried to land in the country over the weekend. The crash killed all but 2 of the 181 people on board. Days after the crash, there were still far more questions than answers about the country's worst aviation disaster in decades. Authorities ordered an immediate inspection of all Boeing 737 aircraft operated by the country's airlines. That's dozens of planes in total. But there was still no clear indication as to whether a system malfunction, human error, or some combination of factors caused the disaster. Experts from the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board and Boeing were on the ground inspecting the crash site, and the NTSB was set to play a crucial role in deciphering data from the plane's black boxes, which record information from the cockpit and aircraft systems. Officials have warned it could be months before they have any clear answers.
Yeah, there was significant damage there to even the black box, leading them to have to call in the Americans to be able to decipher the data from the black box, what was going on in those final moments in the cockpit and with the various equipment on the plane. A reminder here, if you weren't following this, over the holiday break, the Jeju Air flight took off from Bangkok, Thailand, was approaching its scheduled landing at Muan International Airport in southern South Korea. After an initial failed landing attempt, the pilots received a bird strike warning from the ground control center. It then ascended again before trying to make a landing the second time around. 2 minutes later, the plane's crew sent a distress signal and attempted to land on a different runway. The plane touched down 3 minutes later without lowering its nose landing gear. So it tried to make a belly landing on the runway there. It made it at a very high speed. It didn't land even at the start of the runway, sort of the middle of the runway. So it skids along the runway at a very high speed. It overshoots the runway, slams into a concrete wall that was at the end of the runway there, bursting into a fireball. Again, as you mentioned, Jill, only 2 survivors, still remarkable though, 2 survivors, 2 flight attendants were rescued from the tail section. We'll wait to hear what they have to say or what they remember here. But still a lot of questions because apparently on that Boeing jet, the pilots had the ability to manually lower the landing gear, even if there was a major equipment malfunction there due to a bird strike or some other issue. It's not clear why they didn't do that. It's not clear why they so urgently felt the need to land on the belly of the plane that they couldn't make another pass around, try to head to the runway they were directed to. So there's going to be a lot of focus there on the black box. We should know Jeju Air and this particular Boeing jet actually have a pretty good safety record, leading to questions about potential user error, pilot error there. Jill, given this tragedy and also the Azerbaijan jet that was, it looks like, shot down by Russian anti-aircraft missile over the holiday break, I just want to remind folks, despite those 2 tragedies, that there are more than 100,000 flights every day in the world carrying 15 to 20 million people that land totally safe. So I know it was sort of a freaky situation to have 2 airline tragedies that took place between Christmas and New Year's there. Just a reminder that flying still is the safest way to travel.
And speaking of travel, from NBC News, women are increasingly planning leisure trips just for themselves. Nearly 40% of female travelers have voiced interest in setting out solo in 2025. This is according to the tourism market research firm Future Partners, and it's up 8% from just a year earlier. Travel operators are now working to cater to them. There has been especially strong demand among older women. There is an emerging space that is normalizing and encouraging travel for older women, particularly for those whose partners may not be able to travel with them or for women who have lost a partner. And it's also become more acceptable for women to leave their families, partners, or spouses behind and travel with a group of like-minded women. Luxury travel network Virtuoso has also found that nearly 3/4 of its solo clients are women, about 47% divorced, separated, or widowed, part of a surge in what they are calling post-partner or family-raising travel.
Interesting trend line here. It comes as women are empowered, whether they have a partner or not, as you mentioned, to get out there. In some cases, male partners who just don't want to go anywhere. And the women who want to be able to travel the world on their own. So you're seeing a bunch of these travel companies start up here, try to cater to women, take them in various groups. Many of these travelers are older, middle, or upper income adults who've watched their stock portfolios or home values climb in recent years and now feel much more comfortable treating themselves. Women have always faced a distinct set of challenges here, traveling independently, ranging from, security and safety issues to other inconveniences, depending on what country or what places you're going to. But you see a lot of these businesses starting up here, catering to solo female travelers. G Adventures is one. That's a group out of Toronto, according to the story, launching what they call solo-ish trips. They apparently focus on also employing female guides, vetting activities like homestays or meals with locals, etc., to ensure the women feel comfortable on these trips.
And finally, from Axios, we're now more than 24 hours into welcoming our newest generation, Generation Beta.
Welcome to Earth, kiddos.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. I don't know if this is a good time to be born.
What's remarkable, these kids, Jill, they're going to see the 22nd century, potentially.
Okay, so Mark McCrindle, who's a demographer and social analyst, has been given credit for the name Generation Alpha. That's for everyone who's born between 2010 and 2024. He wrote in a blog post that this new generation will span from this year until 2039. So generations typically last between 14 and 15 years. Even more than Gen Alpha, Gen Beta will be defined by unpredictable technological advancements, artificial intelligence, and also a climate crisis. It will be the second generation besides Alpha, whose birth span from about 2010 through 2024, to be born entirely in the 21st century. There are about 2 billion Gen Alphas, if that's what they're called. And Beta is expected to have about 2 billion as well. And Moshe, as you said, many will live to see the turn of the 22nd century. By 2035, the age group will make up about 16% of the population.
The global population. Not 2 billion Gen Beta in America, 2 billion Gen Beta globally. So the generations here, people are always curious about this stuff. They basically come about based on authors, demographers, magazine articles trying to coin names for generations. And that's where you got names like the Greatest Generation, the Silent Generation, the Boomer Generation. And then, of course, you had Gen X. Gen Y came after Gen X, but Jill, we commonly are known as millennials because that sort of took root based on a couple magazine stories. So millennials got their name. They last through 95, 96. That then begins the era of Gen Z from 96 to 2010. Then, as you mentioned, you got Alpha running until last year, and now Beta. But as we know, things change a lot over 15 years, especially with technology as it is today. So even various generations, like the millennials, right, that began in the early 80s but last into the mid 90s, there's a big difference between them. And same thing with the Gen Zers. The Gen Zers who were born in 96, 97 versus, say, a Gen Zer who was born in 08 or 09 would have a significantly different experience with technology and in life. So even if you fall in the same generational cohort, you might be, very different based on what end of the generation you fall in. And then, Jill, there's the cuspers, like you, where you're
aware.
Where you're like, I don't feel like a Gen Xer, but I don't feel like a millennial. We're just sort of in between. You're what's known as an exennial. Then you have the zillennials, the Gen Z millennial cuspers. I imagine we'll have the same issue with Alpha Z divide and the Beta Alpha divide, etc.
I kind of use whatever's convenient for the conversation. So if it's good to be a millennial, I'm going with millennial. If I need to be a Gen Xer, I'm going with Gen Xer. But I do think that the cuspers, and I think you're kind of like a cusper too. You're not that far off.
I'm not that far off.
We straddle both.
Well, we do. I am the like leading edge, the first technical year of the millennials. But Jill, I mean, until fifth grade, we had a typewriter.
Right. We still remember VHS. Like, we know what Blockbuster is.
Like Be Kind, Rewind. You know, it's very different than like a millennial born in 93, 94, 95 that has no memory of such things, that only grew up with the internet. Like, we remember a pre-internet era. And we're sort of the last generation that remembers the world before the internet. What's interesting about this Gen Beta group is they're growing up in a world, Jill, they might never have to learn how to drive. Everything might be automated by the time this group, you know, is growing up in the 2030s into 2040s. Wearable health technology, you know, will be commonplace. AI, you know, they could totally have a virtual world that they grew up in. AI friends. I mean, who knows what happens here with artificial intelligence, as we're really at the leading edge of this. But it's going to be fascinating to see, you know, what world they grew up in, especially as technology more and more dictates this world, and we learn lessons from the various implementation of technology, especially with the lessons from Gen Z, lessons from Alpha generation, and what lessons we bring to the Beta generation here. And again, this is sort of an arbitrary demarcation point where everyone as of January 1st is now Generation Beta. I don't think there's any difference between someone born in November of last year and January of this year, for that matter. They're going to have the same experiences, but I think at some point they're just like, okay, we got to do the cutoff. We're calling this next generation, whatever, Beta, and we'll go with that, and we'll see if they get a catchy nickname like we did as millennials, since we started out as Gen Y.
Yeah, they're going to have to get more creative. Is there a way to become the greatest generation without having to fight a world war, Moshe?
Right.
That's the question.
Right. The greatest generation born in the early 20th century. They're the ones who are, given credit for winning World War II, hence the name Greatest Generation. Their kids, the silent generation, told to basically, be quiet and keep and mind their manners. And then, of course, they come back and have, the boomers. Anyway, we could do a whole separate podcast. In fact, there's so many questions about it, Jill. We should do a whole kind of generational. Maybe we bring on this guy, Mark McCrindle, to talk about it, because I think people have a lot of questions about it.
I mean, he's coining it, so we probably should.
the guy who brought you Gen Alpha now brings you Gen Beta. But can we get more creative, Mark? Because now we're just using the Greek alphabet. Speaking of history, here we end with On This Day in History on this January 2nd, our first podcast of 2025. On this date in 1960, John F. Kennedy, a senator from Massachusetts, launches his, what would be successful, campaign to be the next president. Jill, that's when you could launch a presidential campaign in the same year as the election, when elections didn't last 2 years.
Well, technically, you can do it, as we saw with Kamala Harris. It just didn't go well.
It doesn't go as well in that context as we learned in 2024. Sticking with presidential history here, on this day in 1967, before he would run for president, a guy by the name of Ronald Reagan was sworn in as governor of California. He was previously an actor before he went into politics. On this day in 1974, President Nixon signs into legislation a law requiring all states to limit highway speeds to 55 miles per hour. It was a strategy to conserve gasoline in the face of an oil embargo at the time. The 55 mile per hour limit nationally was phased out in 1987. In the 90s, federal speed limits were abolished, all states being allowed to kind of do their own thing. And of course, you see in some areas of this country, you get 75 mile per hour limits these days. We end with a bit of pop culture history here. On this day, 56 years ago, January 2nd, 1969, the Beatles convened in studio to record what would be their 12th and final album, Let It Be. Turning 42 years old today, Michael Jackson's Billie Jean. And turning 32 years old today, Jill, a song near and dear to many Gen Xers, Xennials, and older millennials, Informer.
What are they saying? I still don't know.
Boom now.
It is telling that of all of the songs that you listed, this is the one I'm excited about.
Yeah, listen, 1993. We've talked about this on the podcast before, that the music that comes out between, I think, the ages of like 11 and 18 or something, in your, like, you have, like, people, they've done studies on this, that you have, like, either you have the best knowledge of the lyrics and the most affinity for throughout your life. That it's that key period of time the whatever music or movies or whatever comes out, you have it stays near and dear to you throughout your life.
It certainly has for me, Moshe. And with that, a wrap of our first daily podcast of the new year. I hope everyone, again, had a wonderful New Year's. We want to thank you for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It helps us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And review us in the App Store.
Informer, yeah, no, say daddy me, snow me, I go to blame. A licky boom boom down. A licky boom boom down. That I just looked it up. There you go. Guys.
Welcome to the 90s.
Welcome to the 90s. The year is 2025. The 90s were a long time ago, but we will always take a moment in On This Day in History to bring something back to you.
All right, everyone, have a great day.